Welcome, everybody, to the 15th session on Angular at FluentConf, and the last. Save the best for last. This is AngularJS and the computer science of JavaScript. This is an hour-long presentation. We're going to cram it into 30 minutes. And my guess is towards the end, it's going to get really interesting. I also realized that this is a horrible title for this presentation because somebody was asking me, they're like, what are you speaking on? I said, well, I'm doing AngularJS and the computer science of JavaScript. And they were like, well, what's it about? Obviously, I should rename this presentation to something else. If you wouldn't mind, I would appreciate your help with this particular session. You can go to this URL on the blazing fast Wi-Fi, and you can rate me as I speak. This is real-time feedback, and then later I can go back and look at it and see how I did. So that would really help. Or you can scan this QR code here from your seat. You guys ever seen the flowchart for QR codes? All right. So good. So the title from this presentation actually comes from an article I wrote for Adobe about 2 years ago when I was first trying to learn Angular, because Angular is pretty easy until you get to directives and then everybody hits this wall. And I thought it was not because things are hard, but because the terminology gets so computer sciencey that it was starting to lose me, and it was making me feel real stupid. And so I wrote this article to sort of try to explain in layman's terms what a directive was and how to build it. And that's where this presentation derives from, is this article. I want to point out this lovely photo that my friend John Bristow made for me with my Easy Bake Oven for my presentation. I was really happy with this. I just want to make sure it got screen time for you, John, since you spent so much time on this instead of doing actual work. So, for us as JavaScript developers, the world has been incredibly kind to us. I mean, almost at sort of a creepy, ridiculous level, to where it's beginning to get a little bit uncomfortable and awkward, maybe even. If we were going to try to quantify the number of libraries that we deal with, every day or every year, or the sheer Cambrian explosion, if you will, of JavaScript frameworks, it'd be very, very hard. There's one site from Thomas Fuchs, Micro.js, which attempts to sort of help solve this problem, but I don't think it probably contains maybe 1/10 of the available JavaScript libraries. But you can come in here and say what you want. Like if you need a mouse one, there's Mousetrap. My favorite's Hamster.js. I don't know what that does, but I want to use it because it's called Hamster.js. I'll click off to the side here. There we go. And so we've had Backbone, we've had Spine MVC, we've had a bunch of these great JavaScript frameworks. And when I first did this presentation, the new kid on the block was Angular, but I don't know that that's necessarily true anymore. I think he's sort of kind of the big kid on the block now. But Angular is sort of the first open source project that we've seen come out of a commercially backed institution, in this case being Google. So that makes it very, very interesting. And the first time I actually saw Angular was 2010, when Mishko did a presentation on it at Google I/O, and he was using Eclipse. And I watched that presentation and thought, I don't know what that is, but I'm pretty sure it's not JavaScript. I think that's Java. It looked so crazy to me. So Angular's hot. I saw this tweet, and I thought this was very telling. 15 Angular sessions, obviously, it's sort of a big deal. Angular is so interesting for us because it is kind of forcing developers to think in a new way. Or as Bob Dylan said, the times, they are a-changin'. Everybody knows this, right? This imperative syntax where we have a div and it has an ID or a class or something that we can select it by. And then we can take that and we can transform that into a calendar. I'm using Kendo UI. You could be using Jquery UI or Widget or what have you. And this is how we created components to substitute what HTML sort of left us without, because there isn't a calendar in HTML, and so you're sort of forced to make your own. The problem with this is that the JavaScript and the HTML live in two different places if your app is structured correctly. Sometimes they're in the same page, and they're in the same page in production, but when you're in development, they should be in two different places. And that gets kind of problematic when you get into this area here. Like, how many calendars did I just initialize? The correct answer is all of them. Right? So you have no idea by looking at this code how many calendars there are, where they are, what they do. And we do this a lot, and this leads to sort of what we call the Jquery Explosion, where the code becomes much less maintainable. Possibly even worse than that is this. Where is that window in the DOM when it comes from the server? Anybody know? Nowhere. Doesn't exist. Not until that piece of JavaScript runs, and then it does, and it gets appended to the DOM. So if you're the developer that's tasked with going and changing the content of that window, good luck. Someone once said that you should code not for yourself, but for the moron who will come behind you and maintain your code, and that moron is most likely going to be you. It's a great quote. I wish I could remember who said that. I would give him credit. It's Brian something or other. I tried, Brian. So this is the fundamental problem, is that a div is not a calendar. A div is a div. But we've gotten to the point where everything is a div. Our page is full of divs, and it has selectors, and we grab those things, and we turn them into calendars, or grids, or schedulers, or tree views, and everything is so mutated from its original purpose that the HTML isn't really even doing anything anymore. And that's because we sort of relegated HTML to this back corner, and we're like, you're not really good for doing much of anything. Block level and inline elements, that's about it. And since you leave us so far short, we're just not even going to deal with you. We're just going to go straight to the JavaScript. And then there was sort of this shift to saying, what if we could put the configuration back into the HTML? And so there's a lot of different libraries that do this. Kendo UI does it like this, where we assign roles to things. And this was actually requested by one of the other teams who were building a large application. And they said, we cannot build this app with all this imperative markup. It's really difficult. It doesn't scale very well. It's hard for us to maintain. And so we created this declarative UI. This is how it works. And then you initialize the element or the entire document in this case. The problem with that is that configuration is rarely static. Usually the configuration is coming from the server. Like you're very rarely setting a date in the HTML for your component. You're usually passing a date down from the server if you're using, say, a date picker. And so we have these view models. So this is similar to Knockout. Knockout made this famous. However, it got a bad rap because Knockout allowed you to do things inside of the binding syntax that was a little bit quirky. So you could iterate over objects, you could do logical expression trees, you could do if statements. All of this stuff was available inside of the HTML, and that didn't fit very gracefully together. And so what it caused was a lot of people saying, like, Knockout is not good because it lets you do this, when that's actually not true. It was being abused. So Angular is sort of the best of both of these worlds. It's the declarative side and the two-way binding side, while sort of you can write bad Angular code, but if you're following best practices, it sort of saves you from doing that. So let's take a look at a very simple Angular project here. There's nothing fancy about this one. We have our HTML. We have our nice form here. And of course, we have Twitter Bootstrap, because you cannot make an application without Twitter Bootstrap. Don't let anybody tell you differently. That is a fact. Now, so if you've used Angular before, right, this is old hat. But just for those of you who haven't, there's an ng app attribute up here at the top, which turns this into an Angular application. And then there's no other JavaScript in here. There's just these first name and last name template items here, and then these ng model attributes for first name and last name. And actually, as you type this, I can come in here and type, right? And it actually updates in real time because of the two-way binding. And what's interesting is that those items don't actually exist in a view model anywhere, but Angular is smart enough to create that view model behind the scenes. So it's doing a lot of work for you. I mean, the simplest Hello World application that you can probably write with a JavaScript framework is with Angular. It starts off being very, very simple. Next slide, let's go. There we go. So this works really, really well with HTML, and Angular has a bunch of built-in directives and these attributes that you can use out of the box. But when you start using widgets, this gets a little bit more complex. Because when you want to mutate the DOM, we're used to doing this imperative style of grabbing this element, and then mutating it with a jQuery method. And because Angular doesn't work that way, or doesn't allow you to work that way, you can't do that anymore. So normally this is what we would do. If we had a first name and last name, we wanted to add a birth date field, maybe we would use the date picker, but we're probably going to use some sort of JavaScript widget date picker, because date picker support isn't great in browsers. Chrome's is decent, but I don't even like the look and feel of it. So we'd probably go out and grab a date picker, and then we do something like this, right? Select it, and then turn it into a date picker. And that works great. We've been doing that for a long time. The problem is that when we begin to structure an Angular application, this whole paradigm sort of falls apart, because you never have an opportunity to do this. So an Angular app is sort of structured like this, and very simply. You have an area in the DOM where you're going to render your different partials and views, and then you have a route. This is a router here, and for each route, you're loading a controller. And the controller contains the view model that's going to be bound to the DOM, and the DOM fragment that you want to load into the body or the container there. And here's your controllers down here. Now, when I first was writing Angular, I got into the controllers, and I was like, well, surely there's like an element being passed into the controllers that I can use. But there's not. And so what you want to do is something like this. Let's breeze through that and go here. You want to do something like this, where you have the same form, but you've moved everything into a controller, and you want to do this. It's very tempting. Just select the element, turn it into a date picker, and move on with your life. The problem is that you're not supposed to touch the DOM from the controller, which is why there's no reference to the DOM in the controller. And so if you can't do this, then what do you do? Well, unfortunately for you, you are going to be writing a directive. Anything that starts with an ng is a directive. Angular has several directives out of the box. ng model, ng select, ng repeat. And you can also make your own. In fact, they expect that you will make your own directives to create reusable chunks of UI, and also to wrap your existing widgets. The problem is that directives have sort of a convoluted API, in my personal opinion. When you go there and you see words like pre and post linking, compilation, transclusion, terminality, this stuff really, for me as a developer, is sort of a turnoff, because it makes me feel dumb. And so when I go read that, I've never seen, if you're using a word that I've never seen before, right, that's kind of daunting to me. And I don't think I'm the only person in this room that would look at transclusion and be like, I don't know what that means. For the record, it's a computer science term for including one part of a document in another. I would have called it merge. It's just me. Kathy Sierra once said that if developers can't figure out how to use your API without reading the manual, then you better have a pretty good manual. And Mishko Havery said there's only two types of documentation: the kind people don't read and the kind they complain about. And this is true. So if you're actually having to go through the documentation, you're complaining. If you're not complaining, then you're not reading it. Unfortunately, directives cannot be figured out just by working with them. You do need to read the documentation, and that's where the wall comes. So let's take a look at a simple directive. This directive is going to wrap our date picker. You can see that there's a module declared. You always have to start with a module. And then we have a directive. And we've called that directive date picker. And inside of your directive, you need to return a function. A function is commonly referred to as a linking function, but it's a function that's going to do something. So when Angular parses the DOM and hits this attribute, element, comment, or class that you've specified right here, this date picker, it's going to execute whatever code is in here. And you can see that right there, inside of there, that's the reference to the DOM. You're getting it right there. And then we add the directive into the module, and we rock on. So if I run this, you can see that we have this birth date field here, and we actually have a date picker at the moment. So because I've declared this directive, I'm going to come over to the HTML. Let me scroll down here. And right here, on this input, I can put date picker, just as the attribute. Because I've declared that directive, I built it, I've injected it into the module, and now I can use it. So when I run this, we get a date picker. Just like that, pretty cool. And we could additionally wire this up to the controller, as we'll see here in just a second, to do the two-way binding. Now, directives allow you to use elements or attributes or classes or even comments. And so one of the things that makes people really nervous about Angular is they're like, should you be making your own HTML elements? Is that a good idea? I don't know. For a long time, we've said no, right? If it's not part of the standard, then we don't want to use it. That's dangerous. Is it really a good idea to go off and start making things that don't actually exist as HTML elements? Maybe. And so Angular offers you a couple of different ways to use it. You use it as an attribute, an element, a comment, or a class. In this case, let's go ahead and use it as an element. So above our linking function here, we can add a restrict. And so we can say, we only want you to be able to use this on an element and not an attribute. So let's go make that change in the HTML. Down here. So here's our HTML, and I've actually already done it there. So you can see there's a date picker attribute, and just like that, we've created our own HTML attribute. And as long as we've dropped this directive in with our page in any application, we now have a date picker HTML element, which is pretty awesome. So when I run this, it looks great, right? It's perfect. Not really. Actually, it looks really bad. There's nowhere to type. Can't click on it. What happens if I do this? Something is very wrong there. All right, what's the problem? Well, let's open up the dev tools and find out. So I'm just going to click on this little element here. Let's go in, and let me up the size here. All right, so there we go. There's a span. So here's our date picker. And so here's our date picker. Okay. The problem here is that a date picker is composed of an input element, remember? But Chrome is looking at this and saying, oh, that's a date picker. So what does Chrome do with any element that it doesn't recognize? Anybody know? How does it render it? It's block level element, similar to a div. So it doesn't know what to do with that element. So it's like, div? Maybe you said date picker, maybe you meant div. And so because it's a div, we can't type into the div. The widget itself requires an input as a base type. So in order to make that happen, Angular allows us to do something with templates. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to hide this HTML here. Let's bring this JavaScript over. And let's change our restriction back. And I'm going to supply a template for this directive. And inside the template, I'll just say input type equals text. Because in the end, that's what I want. And then when we run this, it works, right? It looks great. We fixed it. Kind of, not really. Where's my laser? It doesn't work. That's the most depressing thing to happen all day. It does work, I just can't see it. So we have an input, but it's inside of this sort of goofy element, and it's not at all what we wanted. It's not a date picker. So again, let's go into the dev tools and find out exactly what's happening here. I'm going to inspect this bad boy. Have a look. So there's our input, and it is inside of the date picker. So that really didn't work out very well. It's not at all what we wanted. And so what Angular has done for us is it said, okay, you have a template. I'm just going to put that inside of this element because I don't want to destroy the element that you created. I don't know what you want me to do, so I'm just going to put it inside. That doesn't help us at all. That just gives us a broken, goofy widget. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to tell Angular we want you to replace. Just replace it. Don't use it. Instead, use this template. And so we say replace is true. And now when we run this, finally we have a date picker, and our date picker is working. What's interesting here is that if you come and we look at the markup here, here's the tag. So Angular did the replace for us, but it also took all of the attributes that we specified and merged them automatically from that unknown date picker element onto this input. So it's very intelligent, doing a lot of work for you behind the scenes. And just like that, we have a date picker element wrapping our widget. Now, the problem with this is that you see this controller down here, and I've got, let's go over here and bind this out so we can see what's actually happening. Let me add ng controller equals, I think I called it home controller. See if I got that right. Yeah. So we have this two-way data binding between the inputs and the controller, which is really nice. So when these change, of course, everything else changes. But the problem is that if we come down here and we say scope.birthdate here, we'll just set it to null. And then let's come over here and bind this date picker. So we say ngModel is birthday. It's actually already there, even though it doesn't exist on the scope, and I just added it. But if I come over here and I say birthdate, and then we run it again, we can change this all day long, and it's not ever going to update the scope. Not ever. And that's because the widget is outside of Angular's binding pipeline. It doesn't know anything about what Angular's doing, and Angular doesn't know vice versa. And so what we need to do is bring this widget back into the loop on what's happening with Angular and the DOM. So let's do that like this. This is essentially the same thing that we had before, but in this case, we've got our input, we've got the replace, and then you'll see this require and then this ngModel. So we're requiring this ngModel service, and does anybody know what the question mark in front does? Any guesses? That says give me ngModel or give me null. That's exactly right. And that's just so you can know what you're getting, so you can expect it's either going to be one of the two. And then inside the linking function, we actually have to listen to the change event on that date picker, because this date picker has its own API. And so when the date picker changes, it's going to fire this event that says, hey, I just changed. In case you're interested, the value is not the same anymore. So we need to handle that change event right here. So let's do that. So I assume we could do this, right? Right? That should work. Let's try it out. Come back over here to the HTML. And let's add in a binding for birth date. We'll run it. Let's change. And it didn't work. Not only did it not work, but I threw an error, and it's because there is no, it's not $scope, it's scope. Let's try that again. Doesn't work. Well, the reason why it doesn't work is because we actually have to tell Angular that it changed. Just setting the value on the scope isn't enough. And so we're going to use an apply to do that. So what we do is something like this. So let's say scope.apply. And then inside of that apply, we have a function here. And then we'll move this thing into this apply. There we go. Let me see. It's telling me I have an error. What's wrong with you, JS Fiddle? I'm missing. Oh, you know what it is? All right, get out of here. I know what it is. Or do I? Yes, I do. Bam. I'm so good. Don't act like you're not impressed. All right. So now we change this value, and it still doesn't show up. And at this point, this can be really, really frustrating. This is the point at which you're working with directives, and you might throw your hand up and be like, I can't do this. But there is an answer here. Let's take a look at that. What we have to do here is apply this, but we have to set the model value, not the value on the scope. That's nasty anyway, because you could be using this date picker anywhere. How do you know you're going to be using it on a scope that has a birth date? And how do you know that scope birth date field isn't meant for something else? You just stepped on it. And so by using this model value here, we can actually make this work. So let me come back over here, make sure I've got my HTML. I don't know why my HTML keeps getting reset here. So say this is home controller. I feel like I'm repeating myself. This is not very dry. And then let's add in the birth date down here. And make sure everything looks good there. I'm happy with that. I feel good about that. So let's run this, and then select the date, and then we're actually getting the date, right? Now, if we wanted to have, this is one-way binding at the moment. It's from the scope, it's from the widget to the scope. If we wanted to go from the scope, or from the widget back to the scope, then we would have to handle it that way as well, or the scope back to the widget rather. We'd have to handle that binding as well in a similar manner. For the sake of time, let's move on though. Let's talk for a minute about timeouts. When you're developing directives to wrap widgets, one of the problems that you have is that you're going to be working with Angular's directives, and you're probably going to have your directive on an Angular directive. Let me show you what I mean. In this case, let's hide this. See this date picker here? Let's do, sorry, I've added a gender drop-down list here. This gender drop-down list, see this ng options? We're creating a select list. So what we want to do is use Angular's built-in ng options directive to build our select list and then transform it with our directive. The problem is, as it is right now, if I run this, there's nothing in the drop-down. And that is because our directive executed before the Angular one, and now we're all out of whack. So the way that we handle this is not with something you probably would have guessed. So here's the new directive I've added. So I'm going to come here, and I'm going to use the timeout service, and then I'll just inject it into this function here. I know you were thinking timeout. You were watching this and like, that dude needs a timeout. He needs a timeout if I've ever seen one. And then we'll just come out, and we'll execute this timeout. Now, I couldn't find this anywhere in the docs, but I did do enough searching to find out that if you call timeout without a duration, the duration is 0, but it executes after all of Angular's directives have executed. So if we run this now, we have items in the drop-down list. All right, so at this point, you'll be like, I got it. If you didn't know about directives before, you know about them now. You're like, that's where I write, that's where I put my jQuery. I got it. You could have just said that and we could all gone home. Yes, but you should ask yourself, do I need a directive? Before you ever write a directive, ask yourself. And then after you've answered that question, ask it again, just to be sure. For instance, you may think that you need to use a directive because you need to add and remove classes from elements with jQuery. Don't. Angular already provides that for you. In fact, Angular provides a ton of the stuff that you're used to doing with jQuery in the form of directives. Angular doesn't ship with jQuery. It ships with the jQuery Lite, which is a slimmed down version, but it will use jQuery if you include that, but only if you include it first. There are 2 days of my life that are gone because I did not include jQuery first. I said things that I wish I could take back. So when you're going about and you're building your applications, and you can either build your own directives or you can use some of the directives that are out there. Angular Kendo UI is one of them. It's an open source project. Angular UI is another one. It's a fantastic open source project. There are a lot of people that have created directives already for widgets that you may use now, like Bootstrap's widgets, jQuery UI widgets, Kendo UI widgets. Or if you're very brave, you're not scared of directives, you shouldn't be, you can make your own. So now what? You can read the article on AngularJS and the computer science of JavaScript where I resurrected the blink tag. That was right about the time they took the blink tag out of the browser. I don't know if you guys remember that. I was really sad about that because my GeoCities sites were riddled with blink tags. So I brought that back. Egghead.io, John Lindquist was here with the WebStorm team. If it wasn't for John, I would not be here today. And I'm telling you the truth in that there's no way I would have got through Angular without John. So if you're looking to learn Angular, you want to level up, you've got to watch John's videos. They're amazing. And of course, the official Angular documentation. Now, this is not as much fun as it used to be. It used to be that they had live comments or discuss comments on the document. So people could go in and be like, this is not even right. I hate my life. And you could just join in with the conversation. It's not that much fun anymore since they removed the comments. I actually wish they'd bring them back. I'm going to put in a pull request to bring the discuss comments back. Sorry. So I really feel like, love AngularJS or hate it, I feel like it really points us in the right direction because while it feels kind of nasty to create your own HTML elements with the JavaScript library, web components is a standard. And once it's a standard, then we'll all feel very good, won't we? Right? When it's the browser standard? Absolutely. And I feel like AngularJS is the first step in that direction. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you guys sticking around for the second to last session, the last Angular session. I would love to talk to you. You can find me on the web in these places. And you can check out our open source project here on GitHub. Thank you so much.